The FW190 won't start. Oberleutnant Hans Weik sits in the cockpit, toggle button the starter again and again. The Focke-Wulf's BMW radial engine coughs, sputters, dies. He can hear American bombers in the distance, hundreds of them, the deep drone of their engines shaking the air. Around him, across the airfield at Leipheim, other FW190s have the same problem. Of the 60 fighters that should be taking off to intercept the American raid, maybe 20 are actually getting airborne. The rest sit silent, dead, useless. It's not battle damage, it's not pilot shortage, it's not lack of ammunition, it's the fuel. The synthetic gasoline in Weik's tanks, if you can even call it gasoline, is contaminated, watered down, cut with additives that gum up the fuel lines and corrode the engine cylinders. The Luftwaffe's mechanics are doing their best, filtering and refiltering, but there's only so much they can do when the fuel arriving from the refineries is already degraded. Weik finally gets the engine to catch. It runs rough, misfiring, but it runs. He advances the throttle. The FW190 lurches forward, trailing black smoke. Above him, 300 American B-17 flying fortresses are heading for the Leuna synthetic oil plant, Germany's largest remaining source of aviation fuel. If they destroy it, the fuel situation goes from critical to catastrophic. Weik climbs through 10,000 feet. His engine is overheating. The fuel mixture is wrong, too lean, the engine's starving for proper gasoline. He can see other FW190s turning back, engines failing, pilots forced to land before they can even reach the bombers. He presses on, reaches 20,000 feet. The bomber stream is right in front of him now, a sky full of American aircraft, their contrails writing lines across the morning. He lines up for an attack run, pushes the throttle forward. The engine seizes, just stops. Instant silence, except for the wind whistling past the canopy. Weik's fighter, one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, becomes a 9,000-pound glider. He manages to turn back toward base, losing altitude, the bombers continuing overhead untouched. He lands dead stick, no power, coasting to a stop on the grass beside the runway. He climbs out, watches the bombers continue east, toward Leuna, toward Germany's oil. In the distance, he hears the first explosions. This is May 12, 1944, the day the Luftwaffe began to die. Not from lack of planes, not from lack of pilots, but from lack of something you can't see in aerial combat footage or dramatic dogfight paintings. Oil. The story of Germany's defeat in the air war is usually told through dramatic dogfights, ace pilots, and technological innovation. But the real story is simpler and more devastating. Germany lost the air war at the gas pump. This is the story of how the most advanced air force in the world was brought to its knees not by enemy fighters, but by a liquid they couldn't produce fast enough. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and started World War II, it had a problem it couldn't solve: oil. Germany produced almost no natural petroleum. The Reich had some minor oil fields in Austria and a few scattered wells, but together they produced less than 5% of Germany's peacetime needs. Compare this to the Allies. The United States produced 60% of the world's oil. The Soviet Union had the Baku oil fields, massive reserves. Britain had access to Persian and Iraqi oil through the Middle East. Germany had Romania and hope. Romania's Ploiești oil fields were Germany's lifeline. They produced about 6 million tons of crude oil per year, enough to meet maybe 60% of German military needs if everything went perfectly. Everything never went perfectly. But Germany had a plan. Actually, they had two plans, both brilliant, both ultimately insufficient. Plan A: create oil from coal. Germany had coal. Massive reserves in the Ruhr Valley, Silesia, everywhere. And in the 1920s and 30s, German chemists, some of the best in the world, had figured out how to turn coal into liquid fuel. The Fischer-Tropsch process and the Bergius process both worked. Both were expensive. Both were technologically complex. But both could turn coal, which Germany had in abundance, into gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. By 1939, Germany had built 14 massive synthetic fuel plants. The largest was at Leuna, an industrial complex so vast it employed 35,000 workers and could be seen from space if satellites had existed. These plants produced about 4 million tons of synthetic fuel per year. Combined with Romanian imports, Germany had just barely enough oil to fight a war. Just barely. If nothing went wrong, if consumption didn't increase, if the plants ran at maximum efficiency, if the Allies didn't target them. The Allies targeted them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what happened when Germany actually tried to wage war with its limited oil supply. In 1939 to 1941, Germany's oil shortage wasn't a crisis. Why? Because Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was specifically designed to work within Germany's oil constraints. Strike fast, overwhelm the enemy before they can mobilize, capture their resources, including oil, before your own supplies run out. Poland fell in weeks, France in 6 weeks, Yugoslavia and Greece in days. Each campaign was designed to be over before Germany's limited oil reserves ran dry. And it worked. Germany captured French fuel stocks, Polish industrial capacity, access to Romanian oil fields by intimidation, Soviet oil facilities in the initial invasion. The problem was that Blitzkrieg created an addiction to constant victory. Each campaign consumed oil. Each victory provided more oil, from captured stocks, from occupied territories. As long as Germany kept winning, the oil equation balanced. But war is not infinite victory. Eventually, you hit an enemy you can't quickly defeat. For Germany, that enemy was the Soviet Union. June 22, 1941. Germany invades the Soviet Union with 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft. The plan: reach the Volga River by autumn, capture the Baku oil fields in the Caucasus, secure enough oil to run the Reich for decades. It doesn't work. The distances are too vast. The Soviet resistance is fiercer than anticipated. The mud season, Rasputitsa, turns roads into swamps. German tanks bog down, trucks break down, supply lines stretch beyond breaking, and fuel consumption skyrockets. A panzer division advancing across Russia consumes 5,000 liters of fuel per kilometer. The distance from the German border to Moscow, 1,000 kilometers. Do the math. A single division needs 5 million liters just to reach Moscow. If it encounters no resistance, takes no detours, fights no battles. Germany has dozens of divisions advancing simultaneously. By December 1941, German forces are at the gates of Moscow, freezing in -40 degrees Celsius weather and running on fumes. Literally. Tanks are abandoned not from battle damage, but because there's no fuel to move them. The offensive stalls, not from Soviet military brilliance, though that certainly contributed, but from basic logistics. Germany couldn't supply its armies this far from home, couldn't keep the fuel flowing across 1,000+ miles of hostile territory. Summer 1942. Germany tries again. But this time, the objective is explicitly oil. Operation Blue, the offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The entire strategic goal is to capture Baku, the Soviet oil center that produces 80% of Soviet petroleum. Hitler is obsessed. He tells his generals, "If we don't get the oil of Maikop and Grozny, we will have to end this war." He's not exaggerating. By mid-1942, Germany's oil reserves are critically low. Synthetic production is maxed out. Romanian imports are insufficient. The only way to sustain the war is to capture Soviet oil. The offensive reaches Maikop in August 1942. German engineers find the oil fields completely destroyed. The Soviets burned everything as they retreated. Not a drop of usable oil remains. The push toward Grozny and Baku continues, but bogs down in the Caucasus Mountains. Meanwhile, the flank is exposed. A city called Stalingrad becomes a temporary objective to secure the northern flank. We all know what happens at Stalingrad. The Sixth Army is encircled. Over 300,000 German soldiers are trapped. Hitler refuses to allow retreat. The army fights until it runs out of ammunition, food, and, critically, fuel. Aircraft trying to supply the pocket run out of aviation gasoline. Tanks are abandoned as mobile pillboxes because there's no fuel to move them. In February 1943, the Sixth Army surrenders. Germany never reaches Baku, never captures the Caucasus oil. The gamble fails. And now, in 1943, Germany faces a new problem. The Allies have stopped losing. They're coming back, and they know exactly where to hit. By late 1943, the US 8th Air Force is operating from Britain, with hundreds of heavy bombers. The RAF Bomber Command has been hitting German cities for years. But now, American strategic bombing doctrine shifts focus. Stop hitting cities. Start hitting infrastructure, specifically oil. Allied intelligence has figured out Germany's oil situation. They know about the synthetic plants. They know about Ploiești. They know that if you destroy Germany's ability to produce fuel, you don't need to destroy their aircraft. The aircraft become worthless without fuel to fly them. In May 1944, the campaign begins in earnest. Target: every synthetic fuel plant in Germany, every refinery, every storage depot. Operation Point Blank intensifies. But the oil-specific campaign has a name among the planners: the Oil Plan. And on May 12, 1944, the day we opened with, the first major raid hits Leuna. 350 B-17 bombers, 4,000 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs. The Leuna plant, which produces 15% of Germany's entire aviation fuel supply, is heavily damaged. Production drops 80% overnight. The Luftwaffe tries to defend, sends up every fighter that can fly, shoots down 46 American bombers, a significant victory by any measure. But it doesn't matter, because 3 days later, the Americans come back, and 3 days after that, and again, and again. This is what Hans Weik experienced. This is why his engine failed. This is why the Luftwaffe, despite having some of the most advanced fighters ever built, despite having experienced pilots, despite having sophisticated tactics, begins to die. Not from combat, from thirst, for oil. But the real story of the oil war isn't just about bombing raids. It's about what happens inside Germany as the oil runs out. About the desperate measures, the innovations, the substitutions that don't quite work, the slow, inexorable collapse of a military machine that's starving for the one resource it cannot produce. Let's talk numbers. Cold, brutal, undeniable numbers. In May 1944, before the Oil Plan bombing campaign begins, Germany produces 316,000 tons of aviation fuel per month. That's barely enough to meet Luftwaffe needs, but it works. By September 1944, just 4 months later, production drops to 17,000 tons per month. That's a 94% reduction. 94% in 4 months. The Luftwaffe needs roughly 180,000 tons per month to maintain operations at 1943 levels. They're getting 17,000. That's not a shortage, that's a death sentence. But it gets worse. That 17,000 tons isn't high-grade aviation fuel. It's whatever the refineries can produce from damaged equipment, contaminated feedstock, and increasingly desperate substitutions. The high-octane fuel German fighters need, 100 octane minimum for their high-performance engines, basically stops being produced. Instead, they get 87 octane, 80 octane, sometimes lower. Imagine putting regular unleaded in a Formula One race car. That's what the Luftwaffe is trying to do. Engines overheat, knock, seize. Pilots take off with fuel they know is substandard, hoping their engines will last long enough to reach combat, fight, and get back. Many don't. Here's where the oil shortage creates a cascading failure. In 1940, a Luftwaffe pilot candidate received 240 hours of flight training before being considered combat ready. By 1944, that's dropped to 110 hours. By early 1945, 30 hours. Why? Fuel shortage. Germany still has training aircraft, still has instructors, still has willing recruits. What they don't have is fuel to train them with. Every litre used for training is a litre not available for combat operations. So Germany makes a choice. Send partially trained pilots to combat units and hope they learn on the job. They don't learn on the job. They die on the job. An Allied pilot in 1944 typically has 300 to 400 hours of flight training before seeing combat. Some American pilots have over 500 hours. They're skilled, practiced, confident. A German pilot showing up to a frontline unit in 1944 might have 50 hours. He's never flown in formation. He's barely practiced gunnery. His first combat mission might be his 5th or 6th time in the aircraft type. Against American P-51 Mustangs flown by pilots with hundreds of hours? Against British Spitfires piloted by veterans? It's not a fight, it's a slaughter. German pilot casualties skyrocket. Not because their aircraft are inferior. The FW-190 and Bf-109 are excellent fighters. But because the pilots don't have the training, the experience, or the fuel to practice. The Luftwaffe loses experienced pilots and can't replace them with equivalently skilled personnel because there's no fuel for training. So they replace them with partially trained pilots who die even faster, creating a death spiral. By late 1944, the average life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot is measured in missions, not months, missions. Some die on their first flight. Meanwhile, German chemists and engineers perform miracles trying to stretch the fuel they have. Ersatz becomes the defining word of late-war Germany. Ersatz means substitute, replacement, make do. Ersatz coffee made from acorns, ersatz rubber from coal, ersatz everything, and ersatz fuel. They try blending synthetic gasoline with ethanol. It works, sort of, but reduces engine performance and causes corrosion. They try adding benzene. That helps with octane rating, but is toxic and causes other problems. They try wood alcohol. They try coal tar distillates. They try anything. German pilots report strange effects. Engines that run fine on takeoff, but fail at altitude. Fuel that works for one mission, but leaves deposits that clog fuel lines before the next. Mysterious engine failures that mechanics can't diagnose because the fuel composition keeps changing. One Luftwaffe technical document from October 1944 lists 23 different fuel formulations being used across various units. 23 different ersatz blends, each with different properties, different octane ratings, different problems. How do you maintain aircraft when you never know what quality fuel you'll get from one week to the next? You can't. The Luftwaffe's maintenance situation becomes catastrophic. August 1st, 1943. Before the main oil plan campaign, the Allies launch Operation Tidal Wave, a massive low-level bombing raid on Ploiești, Romania. 177 B-24 Liberators. Flying at rooftop level to avoid radar and flak. Target: destroy Ploiești's refineries and cut off Germany's main natural oil supply. The raid is chaos. Navigation errors, withering flak, German fighters. The B-24s press their attacks, dropping bombs from 50 feet altitude. Some hit the wrong targets. Some are shot down by their own bombs' explosions. 54 bombers are lost. 440 American airmen killed or captured. For this sacrifice, 5 Medals of Honor are awarded, the most ever for a single air action. And the damage to Ploiești? Significant but temporary. Romanian workers, pressed by German overseers, repair the facilities in weeks. Production resumes. The raid is considered a failure, but it teaches the Allies something crucial. Low-level attacks are too costly. but high-altitude precision bombing, repeated constantly, can work. You don't have to destroy Ploiești in one dramatic raid. You can strangle it slowly. And that's exactly what happens. From April 1944 onwards, American heavy bombers hit Ploiești again and again. Not dramatic, low-level attacks, but methodical, high-altitude bombing. 24 major raids between April and August 1944. By August 1944, Ploiești's production is down 80%. In late August, Soviet forces capture the oil fields. Germany loses Romania completely. Germany's last major source of natural petroleum, gone. Now they're entirely dependent on synthetic fuel plants, which the Allies are also bombing. Desperation breeds innovation, sometimes. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Fast, heavily armed, technologically revolutionary. In combat, it's almost untouchable. Allied piston-engine fighters can't catch it. Germany produces over 1,400 Me-262s. On paper, this should change the air war. Jets versus propeller aircraft should be no contest. But the Me-262 has a problem. It uses fuel even faster than piston-engine fighters, a lot faster. A jet engine is essentially a fuel pump that produces thrust. It consumes aviation fuel at horrific rates. An FW-190 on a typical combat mission uses maybe 400 liters of fuel. An Me-262 uses 1,900 liters for the same mission. It burns through fuel so fast that its endurance is measured in minutes. Germany is struggling to produce enough fuel for its existing piston-engine fighters. Now, they're operating jets that use 4 times as much fuel. Many Me-262s never fly combat missions. They sit at airfields, grounded, waiting for fuel that never arrives. Some pilots report being assigned to Me-262 units, but only flying training sorties because there's no fuel for actual combat operations. The most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, rendered useless by lack of gasoline. It's the perfect metaphor for Germany's entire situation. Incredible technology, sophisticated engineering, tactical brilliance, all meaningless when you can't fuel the machines. By winter 1944-45, the Luftwaffe is effectively dead as an offensive force. Total aviation fuel production, 11,000 tons per month. Needs, 180,000 tons. The few missions that do fly are desperate affairs. Pilots take off knowing they probably don't have enough fuel to reach the target and return. They fly anyway. Some run out of fuel and crash land in fields. Some bail out. Some stretch their fuel by gliding with engines off, trying to make it back. Allied bomber formations cross Germany virtually unopposed. On some days, 1,000-plus American bombers and 500-plus British bombers strike Germany, and the Luftwaffe manages to put up fewer than 50 fighters to oppose them. Not because they don't have aircraft, not because they don't have pilots, though pilot quality is terrible, because they don't have fuel. The Luftwaffe's last major operation is Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. Over 800 German fighters participate, the largest Luftwaffe operation in months. The attack achieves surprise. Over 300 Allied aircraft are destroyed on the ground. It's a tactical success. But Germany loses 271 aircraft, and more importantly, irreplaceable, experienced pilots. Worse, the fuel used for this one operation depletes reserves so badly that the Luftwaffe can barely fly for weeks afterward. One dramatic, successful raid costs fuel needed for months of defensive operations. The Luftwaffe has traded short-term success for long-term extinction. After Bodenplatte, German air defense effectively collapses. Allied bombers roam freely. German cities burn. Transportation networks are destroyed. The synthetic fuel plants that still functioned? Bombed to rubble. By March 1945, Aviation fuel production in Germany, 1,000 tons per month. That's enough to fuel perhaps 50 to 100 sorties per day across the entire Luftwaffe. An air force that once numbered thousands of aircraft, reduced to token resistance. The final irony. In April 1945, as Soviet forces close in on Berlin, dozens of brand-new aircraft, FW-190S, BF-109S, even ME-262S, are blown up on the ground by their own crews. Not because they're damaged, because there's no fuel to fly them. Perfect aircraft, useless. But this wasn't inevitable. Germany's oil crisis was predictable, was predicted, and could have been solved if different strategic decisions had been made years earlier. The question that haunts historians: what if Germany had prioritized oil from the beginning? France has fallen. Britain stands alone. Germany dominates continental Europe. Hitler has options. One option: Operation Felix, capture Gibraltar. Gibraltar controls the entrance to the Mediterranean. Take Gibraltar and you control access to Suez, to Middle Eastern oil, to North Africa. Spain is friendly. The operation is feasible. German military planners draw up detailed plans. Paratroopers, mountain troops, heavy artillery. It can be done. Franco, the Spanish dictator, is sympathetic but wants concessions. Hitler hesitates, decides against it, focuses on preparing to invade Britain instead, then pivots to planning Barbarossa. Operation Felix never happens. This is crucial, because if Germany captures Gibraltar in 1940, the entire Mediterranean situation changes. British supply lines to Egypt are cut or severely compromised. Rommel's North African campaign, chronically short of supplies and fuel, suddenly has secure supply routes. More importantly, Gibraltar gives Germany a jumping-off point toward Middle Eastern oil. Not the distant, difficult-to-reach Baku, but the Persian Gulf oil fields that Britain depends on. American military analysts after the war concluded that if Germany had secured Gibraltar and then driven through Turkey or Palestine toward Iraq and Persia, the oil situation would have been completely different. Germany could have been swimming in oil by 1942. Instead, Hitler looked east, towards Soviet oil, the oil that was furthest away, hardest to reach, most heavily defended. But there's a deeper question here. Why did Hitler make this choice? Why gamble everything on reaching distant Soviet oil fields when Middle Eastern oil was closer, more accessible, and less defended? The answer reveals something about Hitler's strategic thinking, or lack thereof. He was ideologically driven. The Soviet Union was the Judeo-Bolshevik enemy. Defeating the USSR was about more than oil. It was about living space, racial ideology, destroying communism. Strategic logic suggested one path. Ideology demanded another. Hitler chose ideology, and Germany paid the price in empty fuel tanks. Let's talk about Germany's synthetic fuel program. In 1936 to 1939, Germany invested billions of Reichsmarks building synthetic fuel plants. It was one of the largest industrial projects in human history. But even at its peak, the synthetic program only produced about 40% of Germany's total oil needs. Why not build more plants? The answer: cost and resources. One large synthetic fuel plant cost 500 million Reichsmarks and required 30,000 tons of structural steel, 100,000 tons of concrete, 35,000 workers for construction, 10,000 permanent operating staff. Massive amounts of coal, which Germany had, massive amounts of electricity, which required more coal, water, which required rivers or infrastructure, and it took 3 to 4 years to build. Germany started building synthetic plants in the mid-1930s. The last major plants came online in 1943 to 44, just in time to be bombed by the Allies. Here's the counterfactual. What if Germany had started earlier? What if, in 1933, when Hitler took power, the Nazi regime had made synthetic fuel the absolute top priority? If construction had begun in 1933 to 34, instead of 1936 to 37, Germany could have had 30 to 40 major synthetic plants operational by 1940 instead of 14. That's triple the production. That's enough oil to fight the war without Romanian imports, without desperate dependency on Ploiești, without the fuel crisis of 1944. But it would have required enormous resources that went instead to building tanks, aircraft, submarines, and the massive conventional military that fought the early war. Trade-off. More oil infrastructure meant fewer weapons in 1939 to 40. Perhaps Germany loses the early blitzkrieg campaigns. Perhaps France doesn't fall. Perhaps the whole war goes differently. Hitler chose weapons over fuel, gambling that quick victories would capture enough oil to sustain the war. He lost the gamble.
Another what if. Germany's synthetic plants were massive, concentrated targets. Leuna alone was 5 square kilometers of industrial complex, easy to find, easy to hit. What if Germany had built 100 smaller plants instead of 14 giant ones? The technology allowed for smaller facilities. You could build a plant producing 50,000 tons per year instead of 500,000. It would be less efficient per ton of output, but far more resilient to bombing. Dispersed across Germany, hidden in forests, built underground or into hillsides, these smaller plants would have been incredibly difficult to destroy. The Allies would have needed to find and bomb dozens of targets instead of just hitting the same 14 sites repeatedly. But Germany didn't do this. Why? Economics and efficiency. Large, centralized plants were cheaper per unit of production. They were easier to manage. They used resources more efficiently. They made economic sense. Until the bombs started falling. By 1944, Germany did start building dispersed underground facilities. The famous underground factories for V-2 rockets and aircraft. But for synthetic fuel? Too late. The facilities under construction would take years to complete, and Germany didn't have years. There's also the defense question. Germany's synthetic plants had flak batteries, anti-aircraft guns defending them, but never enough. Leuna had perhaps 200 flak guns protecting it. That sounds like a lot until you realize 300 B-17 bombers are dropping bombs from 25,000 feet through clouds. What if Germany had ringed every synthetic plant with 1,000 flak guns, with fighter bases dedicated solely to plant defense, with smoke generators to hide the plants? They tried, but resources were finite. Every flak gun defending a plant was a flak gun not defending a city, not protecting an airfield, not shooting at the Soviet armies advancing from the east. Every fighter assigned to protect Leuna was a fighter not protecting Berlin, not attacking Allied bombers elsewhere, not supporting ground forces. The fundamental problem remained. Germany was trying to fight a multi-front war with insufficient resources. They were always choosing between bad options and worse options. Romania, Germany's oil lifeline. What if Germany had handled this relationship differently? In 1940 to 41, Germany essentially occupied Romania, turning it into a puppet state. The Ploiești oil fields were guarded by German troops, operated under German supervision, and their output directed entirely to the German war effort. But Romania had its own interests, its own wars, particularly against the Soviet Union to reclaim lost territory. Germany used Romanian armies as cannon fodder on the Eastern Front, bleeding away Romanian strength while extracting Romanian oil. This bred resentment. By 1944, when Soviet forces approached Romania, the Romanian government defected to the Allies, declared war on Germany, and denied access to Ploiești. What if Germany had treated Romania as a genuine ally instead of a resource colony? What if Romanian troops had been equipped with German weapons, supported properly, and treated as equals rather than expendables? Counterfactual historians suggest Romania might have remained loyal longer, might have defended Ploiești more vigorously, might not have defected in August 1944. But this would have required Germany to share resources it didn't have, to treat allies as equals when German ideology viewed them as inferiors, to think long-term
when the entire war strategy was based on short-term victories. The pattern repeats. Germany's strategic choices were constrained by its ideology, its limited resources, and Hitler's personal decision-making style. Better choices were theoretically possible, but practically unlikely. There's a deeper lesson here about coalitions and alliances. The Allies, despite tensions between the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, managed to coordinate strategy, share resources, and work toward common goals. Germany treated its allies as vassals. Italy collapsed. Romania defected. Hungary tried to negotiate separate peace. Finland switched sides. One by one, Germany's coalition fell apart. Part of this was military defeat, but part was how Germany conducted its alliances. When you treat partners as disposable resources, they eventually realize they're disposable and act accordingly. Romania's defection in August 1944 didn't just cost Germany the Ploiești oil fields. It opened the entire Balkans to Soviet advance. It exposed Hungary to invasion. It isolated German forces in Greece and Yugoslavia. One defection, cascading consequences, all traceable back to how Germany managed its relationships when it still had the power to manage them differently. May 1945. The war ends. Allied intelligence officers begin interrogating captured German military leaders. One question comes up repeatedly. When did you know the war was lost? Some point to Stalingrad, some to D-Day, some to various turning points. But Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, gives a different answer. The war was decided in May 1944, when the Americans began bombing our oil production. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, in charge of Luftwaffe aircraft production, agrees. We could have produced 100,000 fighters. We had the factories, the workers, the materials. What we didn't have was fuel to fly them. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces and a fighter commander. By late 1944, we had the pilots willing to fly. We had aircraft available, but we had no fuel. A fighter without fuel is scrap metal. These aren't excuses. These are acknowledgements of a fundamental strategic failure. Germany built a war machine that ran on oil it didn't have. When that oil became unavailable, the machine stopped. The Americans conducting these interrogations reach a conclusion that will influence military strategy for decades. Targeting infrastructure, specifically oil production, is more effective than targeting armies, navies, or air forces directly. You don't need to destroy every tank if you can prevent them from refueling. You don't need to shoot down every aircraft if you can ground them by destroying their fuel supply. But there's a more uncomfortable realization in these interrogations. Some German officers point out that the Allies discovered this strategy almost by accident, or at least later than they could have. The first major raids on synthetic fuel plants don't come until May 1944. The war started in September 1939. That's nearly 5 years. What if the oil campaign had started in 1942 or 1943? Allied strategic bombing in 1942 to 43 focused heavily on cities, area bombing, terror bombing, attempting to break German civilian morale. It killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. It destroyed vast amounts of housing. But it didn't significantly impact German war production, which actually increased through 1943 despite the bombing. The oil plants were there. They were known targets. Intelligence had identified them. But the strategic decision to prioritize oil over cities came late, arguably too late, to prevent millions of deaths on the Eastern Front, where German forces, still mobile and supplied, continued fighting. This raises uncomfortable questions about strategic bombing doctrine, about the effectiveness of terror bombing versus precision infrastructure targeting, about decisions made by Allied leadership. Questions that are still debated today.